Hello, I'm Daniel Webster. I'm the Director of Enrollment and Adjunct Instructor of Music and Bible at Welch College. I'm also the Music and Media Director at our church. It's a church plant here in the Gallatin area. In my spare time, I like to hang out with my wife and kids, but I'm also pursuing a PhD in church music. Over the past 17 years, I've led music at 4 different Free Will Baptist churches, from small to big, from well-established to brand new church plant. I've also been a pastor at one of those churches and been a full-time music director. I've made a lot of mistakes. I've learned from them. Hopefully you can learn today from 17 years of a lot of mistakes. I've had 2 major priorities at all 4 of the churches where I've led worship. The number 1 priority as a music director, as a worship leader, has been to reform the congregational music, to get God's people singing, gathering together every Lord's Day and singing. And another major priority I've had to aid the congregation singing has been to add and to implement and to grow musicians. We're going to talk about maximizing musicians for church music ministry. You may be the pastor of a smaller church. You might be the volunteer music director. Perhaps you graduated from a Christian college with a degree in youth ministry, and you've showed up to work at your church and they've asked you to lead the whole music ministry. The first thing I would suggest is don't wait for musicians to come to you. You may have a mom who plays the flute or the saxophone, and she's had that instrument slid under her bed for 20 years. You might have teenagers in your church. They desire to learn how to play an instrument, or perhaps they've purchased a guitar or taken some piano lessons. Seek those people out. Identify them and go to them and say, if we could provide a place for you to grow as a musician and to minister here in the church, would you be willing to do that? Some of the easier instruments to add to your worship would be instruments that are in the key of C. You can't just add any instrument and hand them a hymn book and say, hey, play along with us today. If you take a look at this chart, it actually shows you what keys the various instruments play in. Say you already have a piano player. You can add to your piano a bass guitar or guitar player or keyboard player, maybe a student who plays a keyboard with a string sound. It's also very easy to add a flute or a violin. They're all C instruments. And so all of these instruments can play right out of the hymn book. They're also a little easier to blend together. A flute is a lot easier to blend in with your congregational music than a loud trumpet or saxophone. Also, do not forget that you can add singers. They can hold a microphone. If they're still struggling to get their parts, that microphone can be turned down. For the remainder of this video, to think about how we can use these musicians within the worship service. The first thing I'd like to think about is the offertory. Contrary to popular belief, the offertory might not be the best place for you to add new musicians. And there's this new musician having to play her saxophone that she hasn't played in 20 years in front of the whole church. That could be very intimidating. Second of all, especially if you're using youth, it might be that it turns into a performance and mommy wants to use her camera and take pictures and everybody wants to clap, and it turns into more of a recital than an actual worship service. I personally think the best place to use a new musician is during the prelude or the postlude. Folks are still finding their seat and fellowshipping. You might use some of your new musicians during the prelude. Another thing I would challenge you to do is don't overwhelm your musicians at the start when it comes to congregational music. It is okay to use your musicians for just 1 song per week. Let them play the opening song along with you. If you give your instrumentalists 1 new song every week, they'll have 52 songs learned at the end of a year. Now, if you're going to use your instrumentalists for the offertory, I would challenge you to let them play a verse or 2 and then invite the congregation to sing along with them. And then it gets them used to feeling what it's like to sing along with the congregation. While the instrumentalists are playing, to put the words up on the screen, and that way the congregation can follow along. That also helps to take the pressure off of the musician, because now the congregation is looking at the words on the screen. Think through when your musicians will move to and from the stage, and you'll actually want to coach them and give them very specific instructions. I know oftentimes we insert a word of prayer to get musicians off and on. We don't want people to get the impression that prayer is just a transition time. Prayer is an important element of worship. In our next video, we're going to talk about the importance of establishing a rehearsal time. And we're also going to talk about resources that you can have to get sheet music and things like that for your instrumentalist.